Okay. Is it reasonable to request an aide for my ISD level 2 child? Pretty sure there is not an extra person ever in his class. He attends a magnet school where he tested in and has an IEP. Okay. Is it reasonable? Well, yeah, it's reasonable, but at the same time, what you're dealing with are a couple different factors. Um, First of all, your child's in a magnet school, um, and you sort of have to determine a couple things, okay? What kind of support does your child need? So if it's not, if and I can tell you, it's not going to be a one-to-one designated aide that's strapped to your child all day long. And I wouldn't make that argument because at that point, schools freak out about any kind of request for a designated one-to-one aide that is with the child throughout the day. Very few children, quite frankly, need a designated one-to-one aide that's with them from drop-off to drop-off and everywhere in between with regards to the school day. So a lot of parents make that mistake by making a request for a one-to-one designated aide when in reality what they were saying is my child needs targeted support during aspects of his or her day. That is more reasonable. Okay, so you sit there and you go, okay, do you know what aspect of your child's day he would require an aide? You got to start there. Now, if you sit there and you go, well, I don't really know, but I know it's during, let's say, instructional time, or let's say, he's prone to wandering, but he's okay in class. You see where those are different environments where the need may exist. Or let's say when there's unstructured downtime, my child has horrible socialization skills, and I'd like to work on that skill, foster that development, or I want to protect him from bullying from other students because unstructured time is a vulnerable point. I've had cases with all of those factors, and it's not a one-to-one designated aide kind of situation. That is a conversation of targeted support. Now, let's say you say, well, it's for academics because my kid has ASD, and okay, not necessarily bad behavior, meaning that he's not tearing up the classroom, they're not having to evacuate. There are many, many, many reasons why you may need an instructional aide to support instruction from the teacher. Number one, there's too many kids in the class, and especially some ASD kids, they'll sit there and be in their own world. And the teacher will sit there and go, well, I have 20 kids, and, little Johnny never pipes up, and, he looks like he's attentive. So great. But the devil is in the detail when it comes to a lot of our kids with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, things of that nature, to where some of them have learned to fly under those radars, especially girls. Uncanny ability to fly under radars when it comes to these areas, to where they can just sort of mimic the behavior of students around them. And at that point, they sort of get lost in the shuffle because they're easily overlooked because their issues aren't on Front Street for everybody to see. And at that point, what ends up happening is parents typically find that out when testing is done, like the triennial, and they find out that their child is 2-3 grade levels behind, and you sit there and you go, how the hell did that happen? That's how it happens. That they fly under the radar and nobody notices because there's too many kids in the class and not enough support. And how you would sort of identify the level of need for your child is through sort of like a functional behavior assessment. And the schools will typically say, well, the child doesn't have bad behavior. Gosh, guys, what does bad behavior have to do with a functional behavior assessment? Everything that we do as human beings is tied to behavior. I mean, behavior is everything that we do. All right. Sitting still is a behavior. And so too many schools misunderstand the concept of a functional behavior assessment or behavior observation, because the stated goal isn't necessarily tracking toward a behavior plan, because there's a lot of kids that need behavior goals that don't need a behavior plan. Now, in your particular situation, you sort of have to determine what level of need is even required by your child if it is inside the instructional environment, inside the classroom. Now, how would you find that out? What would they be looking for? They would be looking and charting over the course of, let's say, an hour observation in a class. They would be charting by observance, your child's rate of distractibility, their attentiveness. They would be there with a timer. They would be charting that stuff, just honed in on them, every little nuance. The daydreaming, the stemming, tapping of the pencil. These things can make it appear as though the child, and the teacher isn't necessarily going to pick up on all those things because they're responsible for 20 kids. The other thing that they're looking for is the level of staff engagement, with regards to redirection, engagement on the subject matter, whether they call on them, because that's also very critical in that determination with regards to distractibility and attentiveness, as opposed to the level or capability of the teacher with regards to managing the class. And this is not an affront to any teacher out there. Okay, you guys are asked to do Herculean things with a lot of kids in your class and little to no support to back you up. That's why we need to do these observations sometimes, to sit there and understand that there are those kids in the class that we need to sit there and pull them out of their shell, because they may not be getting the information. Okay, so at that point, that's what that functional behavior or that behavior observation would do, is be able to clock within that time frame how much engagement is needed for your child in order for them to maintain attention, in order to produce work, in order to benefit, in order to receive a free and appropriate public education and have access to the general curriculum, because the behavior may be impeding their access to that, even though they're sitting in class. If they're not absorbing the material because of the nature of their disability, then guys, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So at that point, that would enable the team using that data to make a data-driven decision with regards to the level of aid support your child requires. And it would be targeted. And it might be on that threshold to where we just need some additional training on for the general ed teacher, in order to have him or her a little bit more attentive and eagle-eyed as to understanding the nuances of the behavior that causes the inattention, because it might not be obvious. That's how we would determine the level of aid support if it is in the instructional environment. But please understand that even in a data-driven situation to where it's determined that the child requires some instructional support inside of the classroom, the goal is always to fade that support out. How do we do that? Well, we set the goals. We start teaching self-regulation, self-management, those kind of skills, so that, the child can sit there and learn to self-manage and redirect him or herself. And at that point, with data, that's when we start fading that support, because, your child will grow up one day and they won't have targeted aides following them around at a college campus or wherever. Trying to think, those other areas, it's pretty straightforward. If you are looking for the aid support in the other areas, that's where you would start. That, don't scare your IEP team, but that's how you would approach it in a way that is reasoned, it's justifiable, and there's a path in and there's a path out with regards to the request, because that's what the school's going to care about. You know, have it be data driven with regards to the determination based upon behavior observations in the areas I suggested, and then say, look, we set a goal, and then through data we fade that support, because that's what school systems love. They want to know that there's an end here, and so it's just the having that right conversation with them and using the right verbiage, with a purposed and focused approach for what you're trying to determine. And I think I answered that question. Yeah, I mean, that's how I would approach it, and that should cover all your bases.